Larry Johnson is a veteran of the CIA and the State Department's Office of Counter-Terrorism and a founder of Berg Associates. Larry, it's always a pleasure to have you, even if the subjects are seldom pleasurable. Before we go off touring the world, is there any update you can give us? As a believer myself, I'm deeply stricken by what has happened in Minneapolis today. Is there any update you can give us on that?
It turns out so far it was a transgender shooter. She used the names both Robert Westman and Robin Westman. And it's, the last I was informed was 2 dead, several injured. It just, shooting up children in a church, it's just unconscionable. But, we're watching the same thing go on in Palestine, in Gaza. That, this is just, we look at the grief and the outpouring, correctly so, surrounding this incident. But then the world is largely mute and silent as far worse is happening in Gaza to the Palestinian children. I wish that we would come up with a single standard. Nobody has the right to kill children.
Well, these are children of a lesser God, of course. The scores, if not hundreds of thousands of children who have been murdered and maimed in Gaza. The hundreds of thousands of women who have been murdered and maimed in Gaza, and the hundreds of journalists, TV crews and cameramen that this time, imagine all the times that we didn't catch it on camera. This time, if we were watching Al Jazeera, we literally saw it happen. We saw the first tap kill the medical staff in the Nasser medical hospital, and then 15 minutes later we saw the second tap murder the people who had gone to save the lives of those who could be saved in the aftermath of the first attack. It would seem that Israel has gotten away with that crime like it's gotten away with all the others.
It is. This can be brought to a quick end, regardless of what the United States does. I accept the fact that the United States is totally, completely compromised, purchased by the American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee and other pro-Zionist groups. But the countries of Europe, and the BRICS countries, they need to oppose immediate trade embargo. No more imports, no more exports coming in and out of Israel. Shut them down. Break diplomatic relations. Let them know you're not welcome among the civilized nations of the world as long as you engage in these kinds of atrocities. I think the BRICS nations alone are capable of shutting Israel down, but they won't do it either. The only country we see that still continues to stand up and fight is Yemen with the Houthis. They are relentless. They're the only ones that have not abandoned the people of Palestine to this horrific genocide.
Now, you mentioned the word civilized. That word has set a lot of fluttering in the dovecots of the Arab world, as you know, following the astounding performance at a press conference by your country's plenipotentiary there. First of all, what does any of what's happening in Lebanon have to do with him? He was acting like he was the ruler of Lebanon. And why send such mutts as him and Lindsey Graham into the diplomatic, political minefield that is the Arab Middle East, and particularly in the Levant?
Yeah, well, you and I are old enough to remember the first real foray of the United States into Beirut back in 1982-83. Did not end well then. This obsession with Hezbollah as, I'll call that a cartoon terrorist organization as viewed by the West, failing to appreciate that Hezbollah is really a quasi-government organization providing a broad range of social services, medical services. It's not just a military organization. It is there to defend Palestinian people, to fight, to protect the Shia that are there as residents of southern Lebanon. And the words and actions of this fellow Tom Barak are just appalling, because all he's doing is pouring the gasoline on flames of a civil war that had died out a few years back, but the embers are still smoldering. And if this blaze will ignite again, and only this time, Lebanon's very future could be in the hands of fate.
Now, Larry, I broke the news this evening. I say broke it because Trump confirmed that thermonuclear weapons had been transferred to a secret location in Europe. I am breaking the news that that secret location is Lakenheath in Surrey, titularly an RAF base, but as you know, an American Air Force base under a false flag. And that's where these bombs now are, placing Britain at the epicenter of any nuclear conflagration which might break out in Europe. Today we discover that the Russians have begun moving some of their nuclear weapons from their bases in the Urals. The proximate reason for all of this is the continuing war in Ukraine, which Trump said he'd halt in 24 hours, then it became a week, and now it's been more than 6 months, and instead of halting it, he has, whether he intended to or not, given it a new lease of life, given it a new spring in its step. If you look at Zelensky, he's now talking like he's on top of the world again. What on earth is going on?
Yeah, I say don't listen to what Donald Trump says. Watch what he does. While I applaud and welcome the willingness of President Putin of Russia to meet with Donald Trump and try to open up channels of communication, it's always better to talk than to fight. Nonetheless, Trump's actions, as exhibited by the deployment of the B-61-12 nuclear bomb, no U.S. nuclear weapons had been stored in the UK or Europe since 2008. So here's Trump talking peace, but by his actions, it wasn't just in Lakenheath, it's also at least in 5 other NATO bases in Europe that those bombs have been deployed. Now, it's true that they're gravity bombs that would require an aircraft to fly into Russia to drop it, which is pretty unlikely. It would be a one-way suicide mission for any pilot that opted to do that. But NATO has continued to take provocative actions, such as the deployment of an Aegis missile system that's normally on a U.S. destroyer, but in this case, it's now land-based in both Poland and Romania, and it is capable of firing a Tomahawk cruise missile. And a Tomahawk cruise missile is quite capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. So from the standpoint of Russian military planners, they have to assume that all of these moves of deploying nuclear bombs in the NATO countries, having these nuclear capable missile systems in place, having General Christopher Donahue, the head of the United States European Command based in Stuttgart, do a speech in July talking about how quickly that NATO would overwhelm and conquer Kaliningrad, a Russian exclave that's sitting on the Baltic Sea. Then the different attacks that have taken place at Russian oil facilities, the U.S. initiative with Armenia and Azerbaijan, where the United States doesn't have a single strategic interest there, but nonetheless meddling in an attempt to try to put the Caucasus on the southern border of Russia as a threat. When you take all of this together, Donald Trump is not sending messages of peace. He's sending messages of war, and Russia, I think, should prepare accordingly.
The signs are that they are, and as you imply, they would be fools not to. because it has to be assumed by the Russian defense systems that any or all of these provocations could go real. Again, because we're the same age, we remember the 1980s. We remember the Pershing and Cruz sightings. We remember the Able Archer military exercise that the Soviet bloc believed was a cover for a first strike attack on them. And they seriously considered preemptively firing their own nuclear weapons at us. Younger people may not remember that. Other older people like us choose to forget it. But this series of tripwires is filled with terrifying dangers that could portend the end of all of us and our children and their children yet unborn.
Right. Well, in fact, I entered on duty at the Central Intelligence Agency September 15th, 1985. And during the first week I was in a career trainee program. And I remember the very first intelligence classified document I saw was presented and we were being introduced to it was about the introduction of the Pershing II missiles into Europe, about the efforts of the Soviets to resist and try to encourage protest against it, justifiably so. So you'd think after 40 years, we would have learned something. And in fact, we find not only are we failing to learn, we're regressing in our intellectual capabilities when it comes to dealing with the proliferation of nuclear weapons. That many today who are younger than you and I continue to entertain the absurd notion that, hey, maybe we could actually fight with tactical nukes and it would turn out okay. Absolutely insanity. I think recognizing this potential contingency is one of the reasons that the Russians worked to develop the Oreshnik missile, which is, if you will, an alternative to using tactical nuclear weapons. It does not bring the radiation. It is able to be actually more precisely targeted and used to really carry out some destruction. And actually, we've seen in the last 2 weeks that the Russians took out 2 missile factories in Ukraine. And then there was a mysterious explosion at a warehouse in Hamburg day before yesterday, that I can't rule out that it was not the work of a special operations force by Russia, because what was stored there were propellant systems that were going to be used in missiles that were going to be fired at Russia. So I think the Russians are taking a lot of steps to try to preempt this potential escalation, because they recognize once you start escalating in that way, how do you stop it? And there's always great room for error and mistake in the heat of battle.
Now, in the time we've got left, Larry, if there's going to be, if the balloon's going to go up, my bet is that it's most likely to go up in the Persian Gulf. Now, Iran has unveiled a new super weapon, non-nuclear, but totally devastating and indefensible, according to many military experts. The Russians have evacuated their embassy out of Tel Aviv, and Russia has, as you know, a special relationship with Israel. A quarter of the people in Israel are Russian-speaking people. They know the dangers, probably as well as anybody else, and they've closed their embassy and evacuated all their diplomats. The US abandoned abruptly this week 2 of its military bases in Iraq. All of that sounds to me like there's going to be a blow-up in the Gulf. Israel's not capable of defending itself from the resultant retaliation, and that's where the United States is always expected to come in. What do you think are the dangers of that?
Well, the dangers are counting on the United States to be able to have your back, number one. The United States, despite Trump's bombast, and belligerent talk about our great military capabilities. The course of the war, the special military operation in Ukraine, coupled with U.S. naval operations in the Red Sea against the Houthis, uh, coupled with our failed experiment in Afghanistan after 21 years, the United States is actually very limited in its ability to conduct operations. Uh, it might be able to do something in a very short period of time, but for sustained operations, it just simply does not have the strategic depth anymore. We noticed that it's been scurrying to rearm, re-equip Israel with these THAAD, the Terrain High Altitude Air Defense Systems. They come in at $13 million a piece. But the problem is the United States only makes 50 of those a year. There's not a switch you can throw that actually will turn it on. No matter how many new missile systems we sent to Israel to try to defeat the Iranian missiles, the fact that Iran is firing hypersonic missiles, which doesn't mean that it means more than just that they travel at speed greater than Mach 6. What distinguishes the hypersonic missile from the traditional ballistic missile is it is steerable. It can maneuver. It can evade air defense systems, which we have seen we've got video evidence of that having happened previously in Israel during the strikes last October. So unlike the 12-day war that started on June 13th, this time Iran is quite prepared for any contingency. They swallowed their pride. They've accepted significant military assistance from Russia, from China. They have rejiggered their decision-making in Defense National Security Council. Ali Larijani is now in charge of that, playing a very leading role, and he is a trusted confidant of the Ayatollah Khamenei. So, I hesitate in saying this, but maybe it would take Israel launching a suicidal attack on Iran and Iran's retaliation would so cripple Israel that Israel would be forced to put a halt to its genocidal campaign. Let's call that would be the only silver lining in a horrifically dark cloud.
Now, Larry, as always, you're a picture of tropical splendor. That shirt would look great in Venezuela. Would you feel safe going to Venezuela tomorrow, or should we expect an outbreak of hostilities there?
Yeah, that is what the United States is doing there is truly alarming. A great lie is being pushed right now in the American public, the propaganda that Nicolas Maduro is some sort of cartel narco warlord. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, has the Maduro government benefited from some narcotics proceeds that are handled by Colombian cartels? Absolutely. But I can make the same case for American corporations, for Philip Morris, for R.J. Reynolds, for Canadian liquor companies. I've done extensive investigations in the field, in this particular field. In fact, we did an investigation on behalf of the European Union back in 2003 that led to Philip Morris settling with the European Union for $1.5 billion. Sounds like a lot of money, but that's just a week of cash flow for Philip Morris. But all that money was drug proceeds. So to target Nicolas Maduro, this is a play to go after the oil and gas in Venezuela and to limit Russian and Chinese influence in Venezuela. This has nothing to do with curbing the flow of narcotics into the United States. The way you curb that, you crack down on U.S. banks, you can't crack down on U.S. corporations that are taking the drug money and facilitating the activity. That's how you defeat it.